Welcome to Renegading, the show that allows us to think differently. For millennia, we've been told that Jesus Christ died for our sins. But what if, as a social reformer, Jesus was killed because he was talking about reforming the economics of his day? So much focus on sin hasn't left much room for theologians to talk about Jesus' thoughts on economic justice. Someone who has thought about the economics of ancient societies is Professor Майкъл Хъдсън. He's written a book called Forgive Them Their Debts, in which he argues that it was debt that Jesus really wanted to do away with. In fact, writing off debt has been a cornerstone of economic reform for millennia. So we went to New York to hear from Michael about how ancient debt principles have never been more relevant today. Michael, always a pleasure sitting here in New York with you, in your hometown, if you like. We always research you, obviously, and one of the things that we found out more recently is something entirely unique that viewers won't know, which is you're one of the first ever writers on Saturday Night Live. Is this true?
Yes. I wrote the LaRouche Evening Theatre with Al Franken and some of the others. They wanted to do a parody of Lyndon LaRouche's View of the World. And they were worried that somebody was going to sue them, so they had me go through the EIR, their nutty publication. They did it on the night that Oprah Winfrey was hosting Saturday Night Live. They did it as the last skit, and I think Al Franken played Henry Kissinger acting as a mule carrying dope for the Queen of England. LaRouche sued, as we expected, the NBC, I think for $1 million. The jury ended up giving an award of $2 million to NBC for the harassment of LaRouche.
Brilliant.
So, because everything they did, we took directly from the EIR, and so that was my bit of comedy.
Fantastic. So, superstar economist and also brilliant comedy writer. So, a different bit of writing is your latest book. Not many jokes in your new book, which is Forgive Them Their Debts. Why did you write it, and what's the sort of central thesis?
Well, I went to a meeting for the United Nations in Mexico City in 1979 on Third World North-South debt. I was an advisor to UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, that was following Third World debt. And I'd learned already on Wall Street at Chase Manhattan Bank that the third world, most Latin American countries, African countries, were absolutely at their limit. They couldn't pay any more debts. And I realized that the debts had to be canceled. I gave a speech there, and there was literally a riot after it. There was a man who I think was a CIA plant who was a reporter and who said, after I gave my speech, that I'd said that the third world would have to work hard to repay the debts. So I stood up and demanded an apology from the president of Mexico for permitting a CIA American operative to misrepresent and falsify what I was saying. I pulled out the American delegation. I pulled out the Canadian delegation. We all walked out, and didn't know what was going to happen, but I realized that the, people had difficulty understanding the idea that most debts couldn't be paid, and that that was natural, that every economy tends to get out of balance and develop a larger amount of debt that can be paid, and the question is, what happened then? So I decided, since I was advocating by that time a debt cancellation for third world countries, that I was going to write a history of debt cancellations. And it took me about a year to go all the way back in time to Greece and Rome, Solon's debt cancellations founding the Athenian democracy, the Spartans' debt cancellation, the 7th century Greek tyrants' debt cancellation. I realized that there was hints of something in Babylonia and Sumer. People would refer to the Jubilee law of Leviticus 25 in the center of Mosaic law, and Jewish law of reflecting Babylonian law. And there was no economic history of the ancient Near East, no economic history of Sumer and Babylonia. The popular histories were all about Sumerian literature, writing, how modern they were. And I didn't read cuneiform, but I it wouldn't have helped if I did, because the translations of the Sumerian and the Babylonian debt cancellations were different in every single language. The American, Samuel Kramer, said that when Urukagina canceled the Sumerian debts in around 2200 BC, this was a tax reduction. And he wrote a letter to the New York Times when Ronald Reagan was elected, saying, Ronald Reagan, do what Urukagina did and cancel the debts for the rich people, obviously. And this was exactly the opposite. Yeah. Well, I then began to collect all the debt cancellations I could find from Sumer, Babylonia. I mentioned it to a friend of mine at the Peabody Museum. I was almost immediately made a research associate in Babylonian archaeology in 1984 at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Mm-hmm. And we decided to create a colloquium that would write an economic history of the ancient Near East. A debt was really the imbalance in the various sectors of the economy. So you had to discuss how did the economy operate and what was the role of debt and why did rulers throughout the Bronze Age, every Bronze Age ruler we know, what was their logic in canceling the debts when they'd take the throne, or when there was a drought or a flood or reasons to cancel the debts, and why didn't the rest of Western civilization follow suit?
But that's the point, isn't it? So the impetus really was looking at the problems, the societal problems that we have today, specifically linked to debt.
Yes.
And what you have gone out and done brilliantly, is give the historical context to this. Because in a sense, what we're saying as a modern civilization is that we're so advanced, we've got smartphones and all the rest of it, we don't actually need to learn any of the lessons of history.
There is an active hatred and opposition of history before Greece and Rome, and especially on the left this is the case. One of the worst offenders was Moses Finley, said the Near East has nothing to do with Western civilization. Well, the fact is almost all of the techniques of economic enterprise, weights and measures, mythology, all of this comes from the Near East, and that is expurgated from the history because the very thought of debt cancellation as preserving stability rather than causing a disaster is anathema to the Chicago School, to the bankers, to the economics department of the universities.
So the victors, in some respects, have rewritten the history, and there's been an amnesia to say, actually, we don't need any of that stuff. We just need to...
Not an amnesia, almost a cutting out, a brain surgery to exclude.
So a frontal lobotomy, really, and we've got rid of all that.
Yes.
And just define the Near East country-wise. Where are we talking about the region?
We're talking about what is now Iraq, which was southern Iraq, was basically Sumer, going north along the Euphrates that turns up into Syria, and the colonies up into Anatolia, which is now central Turkey, and then further eastward you have what is now Iran. Looking back over this history and reading the book, you can't ever divorce theology, obviously, from this treatment that you've written. I don't know any clergywomen who've ever been through a theological school and ever had any kind of briefing or insight into the economics of, for instance, Jesus. Why is that? Economists don't talk about religion or society or anything about how to trade in a market, and theologians act as if religion's all about religion. And heaven and sex and debt is left out. Why is that? Because if religious leaders are interested in social justice, as Jesus was, then it turns out you're going to have to talk a little bit about economics. Well, I think part of the reason is when they translated the Bible into English, German, and the vernacular, they didn't know what many of the words meant, and so they didn't understand that most of the Bible was redacted by the returnees from the Babylonian captivity. People who came back from Babylon, and what they brought back from Babylon was this concept of a debt cancellation, andurarum, a clean slate. And the Hebrew word was duror. And in the Bible, you'll have the words for the clean slate for the Jubilee year of Leviticus 25. They didn't realize that when the word gospel was said, the good news was there's going to be a debt cancellation. They didn't realize that the 10 Commandments were very largely about debt, that one shall not covet the neighbor's wife. That means you don't make a loan to the guy so that he has to pledge his wife as a debt slave to her so that you can have your way with her. But ordinarily that gets just translated as adultery. Yes, adultery, but they didn't get that the vehicle for all of this was debt, that thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. I mean, if you're a creditor, you can't swear that so-and-so owes you the money, and he didn't. That all of this had to do with the great destabilizing factor in society in the first millennium BC, which was debts beyond the ability to be paid, leading to bondage of the debtor and ultimately to forfeiture of the land to wealthy people who were beginning to group the lands all together. And as Isaiah said, plot to plot and house to house until there are no more people left in the land and nobody to fight against the Neo-Assyrian Empire that did cancel the debts. The Neo-Assyrian Empire held itself together by canceling the debts regularly, and after them, the Persians and the Babylonian Empire, we have their debt cancellations, and Herodotus talked about it. But these are all looked at as somehow anomalies. Right. And you have had a work by some professor at Yale University that tried to write a history of money, and I discussed that, and he talked about the market crash of something like 1782 BC. He said there had to be a market crash because the debts were all canceled. I guess the ruler must have run into debt and he couldn't pay, so he canceled the debts, not realizing that the palace was the creditor, right, not the debtor. And this was done by Hammurabi and by everybody repeatedly in order to maintain stability. So you have the economics profession denying in principle that debt can be a destabilizing factor. They assume that all debts can be paid, and that has never been the case at any point in history. So if you would have members of the Chicago School or the mainstream economists today get in a time machine, go back to Greece or Rome or Judea or Sumer or Babylonia and say, we have some advice for you. Here's how to organize a society. That society would have polarized very quickly. The population would have fallen into debt for the creditors. The land would be monopolized. The kings would be overthrown by a democracy, meaning ruled by the rich people, turning into an oligarchy, as Aristotle and Plato and Socrates explained. And you'd have instability, and the land would very quickly either be conquered by other countries, or the people would just defect to whoever was going to overthrow their rotten mafiosi running the country.
In the book, Forgive Them Their Debts, the idea really in modern theological thinking is forgive them their sins. How come you've replaced the word debts with sins?
In every language, the Indo-European language, Schuld in German, but also in Hebrew and the Babylonian language, the word for sin and debt is the same. And from anthropology, there's a very clear explanation of this. If you injure somebody, you would have to pay reparations, or else you would have feud justice. So the result for creating an offense, a sin, is to pay the reparations debt. And you would have the debt and the reparations were two sides of the same coin.
But in English it's been a more reductionist sort of translation. It's just that word debt, and of course that then has...
Yes, because at that point the very thought of forgive them their debts is not something the translator of the Bible and their sponsors looked very happily on. Right. And the very thought of Jesus coming and saying, I've come to cancel your debts, not to save you from sin, you can imagine that this was not how to make the Bible a bestseller.
So my name's Sarah Jane Clifton. I'm Director of Jubilee Debt Campaign. We're a UK charity working to tackle poverty caused by unjust debt through research, education and campaigning. We came out of the UK campaigning in the 90s in response to the wave of debt crises which hit countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Although, you know, colonialism formally ended, it left in place an extremely unequal set of economic relations between countries. So a lot of the debt that countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America were facing in the 80s and 90s was debt which had been lent very irresponsibly by European and US banks, very often to corrupt dictatorships, had been spent on very repressive activities, often like, you know, on military operations to repress the population, or the money had gone missing. Governments of the Global South trying to, you know, tackle urgent issues around poverty, trying to develop their economies, have got no option but to borrow. So we're campaigning at the moment for quite a simple change, which would just say that when a bank lends money to a government, it has to declare it within 30 days of that happening. And that is just a really basic starting point, which would allow civil society and borrowing countries to hold their governments to account. A significant amount of debt write-off is already written into the business models of the banks and the lenders. So when a country is in debt distress, quite often its lenders will sell on its debt at a dramatically reduced rate. And there are hedge funds called vulture funds whose business model is really geared towards purchasing up debt when it's really cheap and then using very expensive litigation to extract the full amount from the borrower. A big part of our work is campaigning to prevent debt crises in the first place. But when debts have built up to the point that they're unsustainable or where they're undermining people's basic human rights, we think the only moral response is for those debts to be written off.
You mentioned the translators of the Bible. You also mentioned the sponsors of the translators of the Bible. Are these the old vested interests?
The Templars in the 12th century developed the whole concept of banking and credit and foreclosure and lending against the land and taking the land out of the community in order to pay the Templars and the Hospitallers, the two banking orders. So the whole religion, if you read Matthew Paris and other 12th, 13th, 14th century writers, it was all about the papacy treated England like the European Union treats Greece, demanding Peter's pence, demanding all sorts of debt service to the Italian bankers that attached themselves to the papacy, like the IMF and the European Central Bank will do to Greece. And so obviously the whole idea that payment debt should have priority instead of society having priority has become a distinguishing feature of Western civilization, and it's the exact opposite of the origins of civilization.
And is what you're saying implicit in that is that modern civilization is actually following Rome and how
yes,
Rome organized?
Western civilization made an abrupt detour with Rome. Rome was never a democracy, and the thought that it was a democracy. The votes were weighted according to landholding rights and how much land and money you had. So it was very much like today. The donor class ran the votes, not the actual voters, who had very little impact. Rome destroyed Greece militarily, first at the end of the 3rd century, when it was called in to help fight against the two kings of Sparta, Aegeus and Cleomenes, who canceled the debts and were killed for it, as followed by Nabis, who also was destroyed. Rome began to destroy northern Greece at that time, and Sparta. It then destroyed Athens and Corinth in the middle of the 2nd century BC. And then during the Mithridatic Wars, the Roman dictator to be Sulla looted Athens, looted Asia Minor, paid his army to come back to Rome and make himself dictator. That was his official title, and rewrote the Constitution and murdered thousands of his enemies, bought up their property at fire sale prices for himself and for his cronies like Crassus, who became the richest man in Rome after Sulla. And Rome became bequeathed its legacy of creditor-oriented law to subsequent Western Europe. Aristotle said that all democracies tend to evolve into oligarchy. The oligarchy makes itself hereditary, as it's made itself today. The first thing the rich people do, the oligarchy, once they get rid of the kings, get rid of the tyrants, get rid of any central government that could tax or regulate them, is they untax themselves, they deregulate the economy, and they do what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan did. They create an economy run for the rich people, and then they expurgate, they rewrite history to say there is no alternative, as if it's always been that way. And that's what modern history is. There is no alternative, and that's why the very thought that Sumer, Babylonia, Persia, the whole Near East survived, keeping stability, keeping their population free from debt bondage, free from slavery, century after century, millennia after millennia, that is treated as anathema, as if it couldn't happen. The Babylonian and Sumerian rulers had, in effect, an economic model that was much more sophisticated than any model that is used by any government today. They knew the economy grew in an S-curve. They also calculated how fast does debt grow. They all knew the debts grew faster than the ability to pay, and so when any new ruler would take the throne, they would cancel the debts, proclaim a clean slate, liberate the bondservants, and return lands that had been forfeited by debtors to their creditors, to restore a independent, self-supporting peasantry that could serve in the army and provide the corvée labor duties which built up all of the public infrastructure.
What would be the modern day equivalent of that? How would that look? Would you just go to the student loan market or the student debt market and forgive all those debts?
Well,
would you go to the mortgage market and say, actually, you can own your house free and clear? What would you do if you were in that position?
Well, the kind of debts that were forgiven were only the personal debts, not the business debts. You would forgive the student debt and you'd forgive the credit card debt and the personal debt.
What about the mortgage debt?
Absolutely not. If you would cancel the mortgage debts of the large landowners today, people like Donald Trump and the large absentee owners would all of a sudden be the richest people in the world because they bought all their property with very little money down, all with borrowed money, and they would become like the landlord class that dominated Europe in the Dark Ages. So you would essentially, the debt cancel, a clean slate would be to turn over all the property to its current users, to its current occupants. They would all have them free of debt, but the rental value of property would all be taxed appropriately, as it was essentially in antiquity.
So what we've learned is that the Romans were basically neoliberal. Babylonia had a land value tax.
And the key of neoliberalism is you have to kill everybody who's not a neoliberal, who doesn't share your belief. That was Roman neoliberalism. There was mass murder.
But is that not today American foreign policy?
Yes, that's why you have that's the history of American support of Latin America, the putting in the dictators. That was Hillary Clinton's policy in Honduras that's leading to the mass exodus of Honduras. America has supported dictators as long as there are dictators.
Do you find it ironic that the usual American foreign policy response has failed in Syria, specifically that bit of the world when we're talking in these terms?
Not ironic, it's inevitable. I mean, essentially, America wanted to control the oil resources of the Near East, thinking that since the 19th century, GDP per capita and energy use per capita are parallel. And they think if we can control energy, then we can put sanctions on any country that doesn't let us buy into their commanding heights, that doesn't let us buy and privatize their infrastructure. Any country that doesn't follow the doctrine of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and the Chicago boys, we'll just starve them out. We won't give them food, they won't give them the energy. And so the Americans' policy since the 80s has been to use ISIS as their foreign legion, to use the Sunni crazies to smash every country and saying, look, we will do to you what we did to Libya, what we did to Iraq, and what we're doing to Syria if you don't follow our orders.
With the thesis that you provided and the historical context that you've written about, how do you begin to use that to influence American foreign policy and influence the economics tradition to start saying, look, we can't just keep going around the world smashing it up because ultimately that's not in anybody's interest?
It is in the interest of the ruling class.
Yeah, but it's not.
It absolutely is.
Okay.
And it's in the interest of the government. You have to tell people there are two interests. There are the interests of the creditor class that ends up doing to the Western world what Rome did to antiquity, destroying it and looting it. And also, because many people consider themselves to be Christians, you say, by the way, here's what we now can translate the Bible, and not only do we know what Jesus said from Luke, that his message was to cancel the debts, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were the library of the Temple of Jerusalem that they left for safekeeping, we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls how all about the Melchizedek followers were all about preserving this Leviticus 25, the Jubilee year. You say this was supposed to be the foundation document of what you call Western Judaism and Christianity, and all of a sudden you've made a travesty.
Was Jesus an economic reformer?
Of course, that's what his message was, and you get it in his parables again and again. When he went back to his hometown, to the temple, to the synagogue, to give a sermon, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah that said, I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord, and Jesus said, that's what I'm That is my mission here. And the people got so upset, they drove him out of town. They didn't like him. And the Pharisees said, we got to get rid of this guy. Luke then said the Pharisees loved money. You know, they didn't like him. And their rabbinical school leader, Hillel, had developed something called the prose bull that said, I waive all of my rights under the Jubilee year when I sign this contract. But in other words, he fought, Hillel and the rabbinical school rejected the entirety of the Jewish Bible. They were the atheists of their time. So Judaism, since Hillel, has been essentially pro-creditor. There's been that strain in it. Maimonides and other people tried to restore the Jubilee year, but that has been sort of subordinated to the history. And obviously, the Christians are no more eager, even less eager, to say this was the message of Jesus, to proclaim the Jubilee year and cancel the debts, not what the oligarchy wants to do.
Was Jesus a land reformer?
He didn't speak at that point about land reform, but when he said he'd come to proclaim the Jubilee, what that meant was returning the land to this debtor who had forfeited it to the foreclosing creditor. That was part of the Jubilee year, as it was in Babylonia. The wording for the Jubilee year in Leviticus 25 was word for word the same as Hammurabi and other Babylonian rulers had used in their clean slate proclamations. So what you did was Judaism simply took over the Babylonian background. And so what I've tried to do in the book is show that there was a continuity from the Near East through Judaism to early Christianity.
Do you think Jesus was a socialist?
That's what Karl Kautsky wrote. Yes, today he would be called a socialist because he advocated a mixed economy. There had to be a check to the power of the independent oligarchy, and without checks and balances, you're going to have a one-sided oligarchic takeover. Jesus was saying exactly what Socrates had said in the Republic, just very similar reasoning, although he didn't read Socrates, but it was spontaneous. I mean, it was sort of obvious from the logic of the time.
Michael Hъdсъn, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be here.